All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just get started with my spiel, but I will be keeping an eye on the participant list, Courtney, and the chat and everything like that. So, I'll be letting folks in as they come in and watching the chat and everything. But I'm so excited to see everybody here this afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Byron Minson. I work as the education coordinator for the Virginia Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And I also have the privilege of coordinating the state Envirothon competition. So I'm so excited to have folks joined here virtually today. And like I mentioned, this meeting is going to be recorded, so we're going to be putting it up on our website and our Envirothon YouTube playlist. So if you need to pop out at any time, all good. This will be recorded and put up there so you can go back anytime. And also, Courtney, I'm sure you're okay with me sharing your slides after the fact so that people can, study from those directly as well. So yeah, I'm just excited to be here today. We have Courtney Hallaker with Department of Wildlife Resources here to talk all things wildlife. She is also our state wildlife judge. So, excited to have someone who really does know the Envirothon program and the wildlife station in particular. So, without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and toss things right over to you, Courtney.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to go ahead and get my share out. 1 second. Ooh, all the Zoom. There we go. Okay. And that still looks great. All right, well, thank you all for joining me today. If you have any questions during the training today, please just pop them in the chat. I will be stopping kind of after each of the sections to just ask if we have any questions. That way we won't delay you getting an answer for too long. If you've ever looked at the wildlife content objectives for Envirothon, there are a ton, like 30 some objectives. So we are definitely not going to get through every single objective today. I have offered to do another one of these in the future to, expand on concepts and really get into those objectives that are not included in this. You are going to see today a lot of information that you may have already seen just throughout your schooling, but that's okay. I'll add some Virginia kind of notes to things as we go through. All right, so there we go. I'm going to move one more thing. It's bugging me, and it's the little screen share button. Perfect. So one of the objectives that you need to know are the components of a habitat. So when we're talking about habitat, we're talking about food, water, shelter, and space. So this is a great diagram for you to kind of bring your head around that. The other thing to consider, though, when you're thinking about components of a habitat is the arrangement of those items. So ideally, species are going to look for food, shelter, water, and space, hopefully within a relatively close area. If they can't find that, then their territory or habitat or range is going to have to then expand. So a really great example of this is if we are talking about black bears. And this is just in my head because I was doing black bear work with the black bear biologist the other day. And so I might reference black bears a little bit more. It means nothing. It's just the work that's at the forefront of my mind currently. So here in Virginia, especially among the Piedmont, there is tons of food for black bears. So their range is actually significantly smaller than the range of a black bear that lives out west. And I'm not just talking about Western Virginia, I'm talking about like the Western states where black bears inhabit. Because those components are far more spread out, those black bears then have to have a much larger range than here in Virginia. When we're talking about arrangement or when we're talking about the components of the habitat, you also need to be thinking about those abiotic and biotic components. So those words should ring really true. You've been learning about them since like 7th grade, if not before then. So when we're thinking about the abiotic components of a habitat, yes, water, that's the one we always talk about when we talk about the 4 things of a habitat. But you have other components of the habitat that organisms are going to need. So when we talk about air, and we're talking about the composition of air, right? So we have some organisms, like the majority of organisms on Earth, that really love that oxygen component. So we're not talking about, organisms that hydrothermal vents. So when we're, though they, however, also need components of gas. So air in different quality and quantity for different organisms on the planet, different minerals and mineral levels, different metals, rock, temperature, salinity, light, wind, altitude, pH, all of those abiotic components are going to be within habitat. If one of those components is out of range for an organism's habitat, let's say that you are a brook trout and you love water that is around neutral, but you have an acid rain problem in the area. So the acid rain gets into the stream. There's no bedrock like limestone to neutralize that acid. So the stream just keeps getting more and more and more acidic. The pH keeps going lower and lower and lower. Everything else is great. Eventually, that's going to hit a critical level. You are no longer going to be able to survive there. So even though it's not listed as food, shelter, water, space, pH is actually part of that shelter component. So think about, when you're thinking about an organism's habitat, breaking it down into those little micro things. If you're thinking about plants, right? And you're thinking about the component of a plant habitat, the mineral component of the soil is very, very important. When we're talking about aeration for water and gas exchange. So definitely think about all the different abiotic components that go into the food, the shelter, space, etc. All right, and then we have the biotic components of our habitat. So in nowhere on Earth are we living in vacuums. So you are always going to have exposure to various biotic components, several of which you probably can't even see, like bacteria, right? Fungi, spores of fungi. You don't necessarily have to have a mushroom in order to have a fungus around. So you will also, within this component, have your kingdoms of life. So your bacteria, which you can break down into your like common everyday bacteria, which would be eubacteria, and those bacteria that live in like crazy places, those archaeobacteria. You're going to have your protists. This would be things like phytoplankton and zooplankton, algae, slime molds. You'll have your fungi, which are like your true molds, your mushrooms, your variety of plants, your non-vascular, all the way up to your great big trees, your different classes of animals, and then your once living things would be all of your biotic components. All right. There's a caveat, which would be soil. So because soil is both made of eroded rock, which is an abiotic component, and dead material, which is a biotic component, you do have this both with your soil. Soil is extremely important. Without your soil, you're not going to get your plants. Therefore, you're not going to get everything else that you want to have, or your wildlife. All right, let's talk about a component arrangement. We kind of already talked about this. This is just a really great graphic. So there are green dots on here. I'm going to point them out with my mouse. That way everyone can follow along. So we have several green dots. We have one up here in these trees, one in these like bushes, over here in this like rock area. And then also throughout anywhere that there's this corridor. So if you're following my mouse, you probably can't see my mouse. Here we go. Come on, let me mark you up. Laser pointer. Over here in this corridor of green, right? So that would all be your cover. Then you're going to have your food components. Now, yes, some organisms are going to eat seeds, cones, etc., from the trees and maybe berries from the bushes, but then you can also have food. And in this case, it's these brown dots. So where my laser pointer is now, including these agricultural fields. I mean, wildlife loves nothing more than to not expend energy in order to get calories. They love it. So if an agricultural field is available and it tastes yummy like a soybean or a corn, they're going to be in there. You have your water represented by the blue here. And then you have areas on this map of insufficient space. So very rarely are you going to find wildlife where there is insufficient space. And I say rarely because we do have some wildlife that is easily habituated to humans, that will infiltrate urban space, doesn't mind being around people, as long as they also have food in that urban space, water, and some sort of cover. And lots of our buildings make pretty good cover. So I'm thinking of things like rats, raccoons, even coyotes are moving into urban areas. They don't seem to mind it so much. All right, so we want these things in an area that's relatively close to each other. So over on the left-hand side of the map, that is where you're probably going to find the majority of wildlife compared to your right-hand side of the map. So the arrangement of these components is very important. We also have an arrangement vertically. So if we're looking at just think about grassy area up into a forest, you're going to have an arrangement, a variety of food. This would be called like your forest layers. So hopefully you have some ground cover and this edge material, which are going to be these like herbaceous plants, typically wildflowers, dandelions, things like that. Then you'll get into your shrub layers, you'll get into your subcanopy, and then eventually your canopy. And then don't forget the leaf litter. So hopefully every single fall you've seen a lot of that, like, don't rake your leaves, it's great for wildlife. And that is true, both decomposition, returning nutrients to the soil, but also for cover component of habitat. Okay. So not just across the landscape when we're looking at those components and arrangements, but there can also be an arrangement of food components and cover components vertically. And there are some species, when we're talking about arrangement, that also really only prefer where maybe this ground cover and herbaceous layer meet this shrub layer. That's where they like to hang out. Then you might get organisms, if you're thinking like bullseye, okay, you have that outer ring that's that it's called an ecotone, which I have on the next slide actually. It's where two different habitats meet, like a grassy area and then trees. And then you have this deep, dense forest. There are some species that only would live in the middle of that bullseye because they love to be so interior on a forest, big patches of forest, that is where you're going to find them, compared to other ones that are going to be on those outer rings and even on those ecotone rings. I told you I was talking about ecotones, so here we go. Ecotones is essentially the edge effect, and this graphic is a great one to look at. So we have our land zone, we have our aquatic zone. You are going to find more species in the transition zone or ecotone of those two separate habitats. Okay. Very similarly to everyone talks about Chesapeake Bay. One of the reasons those marsh habitats are so great is because those marsh habitats are essentially ecotones between open ocean and our land environment. So we have contrasting ecosystems, but they're next to each other. Most animals are going to be located where those two overlap. A good example in like a freshwater area, although we can have freshwater marshes, would be like a riparian area next to a stream. So you have, I have a picture on the next slide. So you have your stream, you have your grasses, you basically have shoreline that's covered with plant material. And then as you go further in where the soil is more stable throughout the year, you're going to find your taller shrubs, maybe trees, etc. This is a great ecotone example here in like a freshwater ecosystem to forest. Other habitats that are very important to wildlife. I told you that I was thinking about bears, and I was thinking about bears when I was making this particular slide. So my other example here is going to be brush piles, not just good for bears, but great for fox, coyote, bunnies, songbirds, all sorts of different species. A lot of people will look at brush piles and just think like, ugh, just gotta burn that, gotta get rid of that. It doesn't look very nice. And while it might not be appeasing to the eye, it is amazing wildlife habitat to have a brush pile. Downed trees, the same idea. A lot of people want to clear downed or standing dead trees. But when it comes to actual wildlife, they provide great cover. Standing dead trees also have a lot of insects around them often, so they're great for birds. Woodpeckers will use them. In this case, a bear is denning in the standing dead tree, which is common over here in the mountains where I live. If you're talking about bear denning sites in the Piedmont, you are going to find them more in brush piles or downed trees, which is what I was kind of thinking about when I first made this. Okay, any questions, Byron, just about like habitat stuff in general?
Doesn't look like we've got any questions in the chat right now, but absolutely put your questions in there and I'll keep an eye on it.
Sounds good. So I'm gonna move on to the idea that habitats and ecosystems are extremely dynamic. So even without human interference, you are going to have natural change over time. So when we're thinking about that, that's succession. Succession is a natural occurrence that happens. If humans were not here and we had rock, we then would have that rock be broken down. We would then have the living things that break that rock down, mix in with the little rock particles and make soil. And that allows us to have slightly taller plants. And then over time, you get even more soil. That would take like forever. I think you had a soil presentation already. Okay. Y'all know all about soil. And if you don't, go to the YouTube channel, watch the soil presentation. Okay. And then once you have deep enough soil, that can then support taller and taller plant life, which leads to more diversity of wildlife. So that process that I just described is essentially primary succession. Primary because it's the first time that that area is going through this change. You would have to do a lot of analysis of the area to figure out if it would be true primary succession. I would say your best, I don't know if you realize this, but there are islands being formed in the ocean all of the time due to volcanic activity. Brand new lava rock just exposed from out of the ocean. It's crazy. Have fun going down a YouTube rabbit hole on that. That area would be ripe for primary succession. When we, as biologists, especially wildlife biologists, when we're looking for the most productive stages of primary succession for wildlife, we are looking right here in the middle. We are looking at this perennial weeds and grasses. We're looking at this shrub. We're looking at these young trees. And if you think about the components of a habitat that we just went over, and you're thinking about that cover component, these stages right in the middle offer the most variety of cover. So they're going to allow for more wildlife and diversity to live in that forest. So what we do a lot is do a lot of burning to keep a lot of hardwoods from growing in areas like pine forests. We want that early successional habitat to come through. We want shrubs, we want grasses, we want that variety. If we have our habitats or our ecosystem changing over time and it has already been an established system, it has been disturbed for some reason, then that's called secondary succession. So if you were to dig down and you have a decent soil layer, but the top has been disturbed, as long as this soil layer is in existence, that's like your tip off that that's secondary succession. Where primary succession, you're really looking at exposed bare rock that was not like dumped there by humans. Okay, so keep that caveat. Now, a lot of people, when you're thinking about disturbance, wildfire is probably the first one that comes to mind. That's probably the biggest disturbance that we hear about on the news. Sometimes it affects us. There was just a little wildfire over in the Rapidan area Sunday into Monday, but Virginia itself doesn't get a ton of wildfires, but we do get a lot of smoke from wildfires that happen in the north. So fire tends to be like the number one disturbance that people think about when we think about forests being disturbed, but flooding can also have a huge effect on forests. If an area was farmed and then abandoned, that farming is technically a disturbance to the area. You still have a developed soil layer, it's a disturbance to that forested area, or even like a field. You're gonna have stuff start to grow back. Any sort of storm damage. I know we had some tornadoes popping up in the Midwest over the last couple of weeks. We had tornado warnings here in Virginia. When was that? Like last week sometime. Any ripping out of that, but leaving the soil layer would be a disturbance. Adding a volcanic ash layer on top of a forested area. So when like Mount St. Helens erupted out west, that would have blanketed ash. That would be secondary succession, mudslides, and then forest management. We're essentially causing secondary succession to happen in an area. So forest management could be any sort of logging. When we do prescribe burning, that they're doing one right now out where I am today, setting fire on the ground to help develop that early successional stuff. Because again, we're looking between this pioneer and intermediate community. Okay. Oh, look at you putting the training in the chat. Love it. All right, let's talk about levels of ecosystem organization. Okay, so this should be like wave review. This is like basic biology stuff, right? But it is one of the objectives listed for wildlife. So our smallest unit when we're talking about levels of ecosystem organization, I'm not talking about like a quark, I'm not talking about like cells. Technically, that is the smallest unit, okay? Okay, I'm talking about organism being our smallest unit within an ecosystem level of organization. So at the organism level, that organism is just attempting to survive and reproduce. That's what it's trying to do. It's do its best to survival within its environment, find a mate, reproduce, pass on those genes before its life cycle is over. Above that, you then get a population of species. That is where you have all sorts of population dynamics that come in. That is where you get your unit of evolution over time, happens within population levels. That's when you see genes being selected for again and again and again and again over time, changing that population, whether it's coat color or coat color is the only example I can come up with in my brain at 4:30 today. So something like coat color, changing over time to blend in because of some environmental change. Okay? The mechanism that causes that to happen is reproduction. So if we don't have our organisms surviving and reproduce, we're not going to have that evolution throughout the population. Then all sorts of different populations of species make up a community. That is when we start to talk about really great diversity. Oh, that's where we start to talk about interspecies relationships. So how do the plants and the animals and the fungi and other animals that are not this like prairie dog that's in this picture, how do they start to interact among each other? How does that influence their ability to survive and reproduce and therefore evolve over time? Then the fourth one here is ecosystem. So this is where you get we start to think about like our cycles within nature. So our nitrogen cycle, our phosphorus cycle, how that's starting to affect the water cycle. Probably all have like the little water cycle dance from in your head from 3rd grade. This is also where we start to talk about the energy transfer within the ecosystem and how do those nutrients get recycled back into the soil so that it can be used again. Then all the ecosystems on the planet, you could put ecosystems into biomes, but we're saying all the ecosystems on the planet then make up the biosphere. This really, when you think about it, really thin layer of our planet that can actually sustain lots of life. You don't get much when you get really high in elevation, and you don't get a ton when you get really deep in the ocean. So the really diverse is very, very thin layer. And we have such diversity. It's great. But that would be your biosphere. And don't forget that our biosphere is a closed system. Now, I know you're like, wait a second. In the news, there were just meteors that like popped up in a couple of different states within the last week. That is accurate. But in the grand scheme of things, very little actually comes into our planet and very little actually leaves our planet. So our planet is considered a closed system. That stuff never leaves. It just gets diluted, moved around. And I have a great example of diverted and moved around on our next slide. Just checking the chat. Saw something pop up. All right. So I've said this word several different times. Bio, life, diversity, bunch of different life. That's all that it is. All right, bunch of different life. Now, there are different levels of biodiversity. So we're going to go through those levels. Let's start with the genetic level. So when we're talking about how a population of organisms, species can change over time, that is due to their genetic diversity. So the variety of genes and traits within a species. Okay? We could go into much more depth about that. I don't feel like this is the place to kind of do that. We're just going to do a nice little overview. But just know that this genetic diversity is extremely important to species survival, both in the short term, but also in the long term. So we do have species on this planet that are limited in their genetic diversity, often due currently to human interaction. So I'm thinking sea otters that were brought down to super, super low numbers where there wasn't that many. They ended up inbreeding, which wasn't necessarily an issue for their general survival, but now there's a virus and it has become an issue for their survival. It wasn't for a really long time, but now it is. Or something like the Florida panther. So there's like about like 80 of them in the state. Their habitat's all sorts of broken up. It's hard for them to get their genes out among the large population, the large area where they all inhabit, and therefore that shrinks their genetic diversity, which can be an issue. Then we have species diversity. So this is the variety of species. We want species diversity in almost, we look for high species diversity in almost every single biome on this planet. There are a few exceptions. Now, when I say exceptions, I don't mean more diversity is better. I'm sorry, I mean more diversity is better. So I'm thinking like the Arctic. There's the food web, everything kind of shrinks. There's not that many species that can survive, but the diversity of depth there is so important and so delicate that if you take one organism out of the system goes haywire. Whereas if you think about here in Virginia, we have high species richness, we have high diversity. If something were to be removed, there's a very good chance that something else could replace that within the ecosystem. And you won't see this huge ripple effect throughout the web, the ecosystem. And then you have the variety of ecosystems on the planet themselves. So we talked about that idea of ecotones and how you have these two very different ecosystems. When they come together, it produces high species diversity with that edge effect. But there are also ecosystem diversity in the way that things move throughout the entire planet. So I am going to show you a video. Hopefully it opens up and you'll be able to hear it, about the Sahara Desert and how it affects the Amazon rainforest. And I'm showing you this video, even though it doesn't have anything to do with Virginia. I find that it's very easy for students to get very pinpointed on what's locally around them and not kind of think about processes that are much larger than us and much larger than our surroundings that are affecting our planet. Maybe. Can my work internet run both at once? Hold on. It just kicked me out for sharing. Let's try this. All right. Well, I'm not going to wait too long because we have things to talk about.
Courtney, if it doesn't work, we can always take the link and just share it with the
Yeah,
slides as well so that people can watch it on their own time.
let's do that. I am going to share back my PowerPoint. PowerPoint. Here we go. And of course, okay. The basic idea of this video is that the Sahara Desert, a lot of the dust from the Sahara Desert blows out of the desert itself, crosses the Atlantic Ocean, and actually comes down over the Amazon basin. And that dust provides phosphorus for the trees within the Amazon rainforest that otherwise would not have enough phosphorus to survive due to the excessive drainage, due to the excessive rain on the soil. So without that Sahara dust, we essentially would not have a functioning Amazon rainforest. And it's super cool. And in years where the lower Sahara gets lots of rain, the amount of dust that actually gets transferred to the Amazon basin is less because there's more moisture in the air. It keeps less dust from being in the atmosphere. And so that was part of a NASA study. That's what that video is all about. Okay. Where there's diversity and balance in species, the ecosystem has balanced cycles of energy and nutrients. So we want that. And then where there's a variety of ecosystem, the biosphere has balanced cycles of energy and nutrients. And that idea of the Amazon was that example of that. All right. While we're talking about biodiversity, I thought I would share just really quickly some species that are at risk just in general. So I'm not necessarily talking about individual species, although I do give some examples. I'm talking about when these species do these activities or have these certain needs, they are going to be more at risk for not being able to survive, reproduce, pass on those genes, and fulfill that long-term kind of living. So those that migrate are at risk. Why? They need that ecosystem diversity. They often need a variety of habitats. They typically have different breeding habitats, stopover habitats, wintering habitats, summering habitats for even some of them. Species examples would be the monarch butterfly and any of your neotropical migratory birds, which are going to be making their way through Virginia very soon. Other types of species at risk are those that need specialized habitats or specialized relationships. So specialized habitats and or relationships can be very easily disrupted. So I'm thinking species that absolutely rely on one another. So the zebra swallowtail butterfly and the pawpaw tree. Those are two Virginia species. The zebra swallowtail butterfly uses the pawpaw tree for breeding and eating, and without that pawpaw tree, there would be no zebra swallowtail butterfly. That is a very delicate, specialized relationship that if something goes wrong there to one of those, the relationship is gone. Polar bears would be specialized habitats. They require both, they require sea ice. They don't live well on land. Brook trout, I kind of mentioned that they require a really narrow parameters for their water quality. And if the water quality gets outside of those parameters, they're going to have a very hard time surviving. And eventually they will hit their precipice and no longer be able to survive. And another species that we have that, at least in Virginia, besides the brook trout, that we would consider like species at risk. I mean, we have tons of them. I have a whole document that I'll share in training number 2, but the bobwhite quail. And so the bobwhite quail requires a very specialized vegetative habitat where the grass is tall, but still allows for corridors underneath for travel. And so without that, not going to be able to survive. Small populations in limited areas. Already talked about the Florida panther and the sea otter, but our lovely Shenandoah salamander that lives in this like teeny tiny, I mean, when we're talking about like a map of Virginia, it would be like a little top of a pinhead, basically. It's such a small, isolated habitat in Shenandoah National Park. So because it requires that very specific place, they're going to be more at risk. And then, of course, those that are exploited by humans, and I just happened, for another reason, happen to have a spotted turtle shell. And this is part of the like animal trade. They love spotted turtle shells because they're pretty and neat. Okay, we're going to go a little bit further. And then I do want to leave well, honestly, Byron, if they're not asking a ton of questions in the chat, I can just keep going.
Yeah, we don't have anything in the chat right now, so I say full steam ahead, keep going. I'll continue to keep an eye on it and let you know if anything pops up.
Okay, perfect. Because I know we talked about like maybe leaving 15 minutes or so for them to ask questions, but we'll just keep on rolling. All right, let's talk about roles of species in the ecosystem. So why is that diversity so important? That's because our species have different niches or niches, depending on what part of the world that you are from. So I'm going to say niche. That is their unique role, position, or function within the ecosystem. It is often comprised of their habitat, so like where they're living, their activity patterns. So are they diurnal? Are they nocturnal? Their resource uses. So do they require like a really high caloric intake? Do they require a really large range, or do they require something smaller? And then their different biotic relationships. So are they a more aggressive species? Are they in the hierarchy of species living within that ecosystem? Where do they kind of fall into play? Predator, are they prey, etc. And then just know that unique niches minimize competition for resources, but unique niches can also put a species at risk at the same time. But it does allow coexistence within the same ecosystem. So my example here is our little tricolored bat. Its niche would be defined by consuming insects, living in trees during the warmer months. They do hibernate in caves during the winter months and being nocturnal. All right. So species with a larger set of abiotic tolerances, meaning they can survive within a variety of altitudes, a variety of temperatures, moisture levels, pHs. They can eat a really variety of food sources. Those species are going to have more resilience on our planet. Theoretically, that would also lead to a larger geographic distribution, like our white-tailed deer. Our white-tailed deer have a huge geographic distribution. They can live where it's really cold. They can live where it's really hot. They find a way. They are a very resilient species. So if we're thinking about long-term survival of a species resilience, white-tailed deer would be a great example. Because if, let's say, the climate gets warmer and it just gets warmer in the north, you're going to be fine. Yeah, white-tailed deer can live in both the cold and the warm, right? They can live in Florida. They can live in Canada. The coyote, very interesting. So the coyote has been slowly expanding its range. Another really resilient species. So they don't have this super narrow niche. They tend to have a broader niche, which leads to more species resilience. Yeah. They are a relatively new arrival to Virginia, coyotes are. They really only started to come in here in like the early 2000s. Now you can pretty much see a coyote anywhere throughout the state, throughout the East. And we're starting to get down into like Central America with coyotes. Pretty cool that they had such a range expansion. And that's because they have that broader niche. Yeah. All right. Oh, this used to be my favorite thing. My students used to love energy transfer, especially this like heat loss stuff over here. Never used to confuse them at all. So let's talk about it. So I chose to start with a very simple food chain. We're going to talk about energy transfer in the ecosystem. We're going to talk about trophic levels. Then, as these slides go on, it's going to get more and more and more complicated because rarely in an ecosystem is there just a simple food chain, right? This gives us a good starting point. So we have our producers down here. Our producers also have the most biomass on the planet. Right? So these are our organisms that photosynthesize, whether they be plants like you're seeing in this diagram, or whether they be like phytoplankton in the ocean, that's actually producing the majority of the world's oxygen. It's not the trees. But that's neither here nor there. But producers, largest biomass on the planet. And then as you actually go up in this food chain, the amount of organisms on the planet, biomass wise, gets smaller. So it makes like a little pyramid, which you're going to see on the next slide. So you have your trees. Let's say the rabbit is eating this grass here. When it does that, some of the energy of metabolizing that grass gets lost as heat from the body. So you actually take about 9,000 calories away from the producer level to the consumer level. So it decreases by 10%. Okay, now we have this rabbit. The rabbit gets eaten by the snake. There's another reduction due to heat loss in metabolizing the food. And then the eagle eats the snake, another loss. So when we're thinking about why don't we see 1,000,000 eagles or the same amount of eagles on the planet as we do producers, that's because there's actually energy loss as the energy gets transferred through the ecosystem at the different level of consumers. Okay? We can't make our own food. Those eagles can't make their own food. If they could, there would be way more eagles on the planet, but they can't. In this case, they are a tertiary consumer. That means third level consumer. Rabbit would be primary, first consumer of the plant. The snake would be secondary consumer because it eats the first, and the eagle would be tertiary consumer because it eats the second. It's a great example of the pyramid. Decomposers can come in at any single level of a food chain. Okay, it can go to decomposers, and then those nutrients get recycled. All right. When we're looking at this really simple food web, because we have two different species eating the grass this time, not just the rabbit. Each organism only occupies one trophic level. So the rabbit would be the primary consumer, and then because the eagle eats the rabbit, it would be a secondary consumer. On this side, laser pointer back, on this side, the grasshopper would be a 1, and the sparrow would be a 2. Right, so you have two trophic levels. The highest level anybody gets is a 2. Okay. And this is just, again, trophic levels was part of the objectives. So basically the same food web, but now we got the eagle also eating the sparrow. So think to yourself, what would the rabbit be labeled? Because it eats the grass. It'd be labeled a 1. Going up from the rabbit to the eagle, following the energy transfer of the arrow, the eagle would be a 2. And then it stops. There's no arrow going from the eagle to something else. Over here, following the arrow, the grasshopper would be a 1. The sparrow would be a 2. And then when the eagle eats the sparrow, the eagle is also a 3. So this food web has 3 trophic levels. Okay. So this is more like reality. Right? This is a Chesapeake Bay food web. It's very complex. We cannot assume that these organisms are all in the same trophic level just because they are grouped together. So in other words, all of these lower level consumers, it doesn't mean they're primary consumers. This doesn't say secondary, it just says higher level, and this says top predators. Because when you actually start putting in the numbers, the trophic levels actually get quite complicated, okay? But we're gonna follow one of the lines. We're gonna start all the way at the left-hand side. The zooplankton is your first thing, it eats phytoplankton. Okay. Goes to the smaller fish, goes to the gall, and ends there. The energy ends with the gall in turn. That would be the top predator on that food chain. Wading birds, also top predator on that food chain. Zooplankton to smaller fish to larger fish. Doesn't end there. We go to the osprey. Or we can go to the bald eagle. So over on this side, we have 4 trophic levels. 4 trophic levels. If we decide to go to the tiny worms and tiny crustaceans, we can go up. Oh, I didn't put it on this one, did I? I didn't. I stuck over here. I'm sorry. If we go to the zooplankton, to the bivalves, that would be a 1, and then a 2, and then a 3 for the tundra swan and sea duck. So I asked this question. What 2 organisms are both a 1 and a 3 trophic level here? 1 and a 3 trophic level here. So take a minute. So 1 would be something that directly eats plants, but it also has to be a 3, which means it eats something that you would label a 2. And think here for just 1 second. It's the tundra swan and the duck. Why? Well, the duck is a 1 when it eats the underwater plants. The tundra swan is a 1 when it eats the shore plants. And then because the bivalves are a 2, and both the duck and the swan eats the bivalves, that makes them 3s. So organisms can be at different trophic levels depending on what they eat. That also makes them more resilient. That increases their ability to survive. Which brings us to our next question. Disruptions in a food web. Yeah, disruptions in a food web. So, what could happen to the organisms in this web if the shore plants were removed? Now, we're only looking at this web. We're not looking at reality. Reality would be far more complex. The organisms that eat the shore plants could be affected. According to this particular food web, the geese and the swans would be done for, because on this food web, that's the only thing they eat. The tundra swans, however, remember they have an additional food source. They're both a 1 and a 3. So the tundra swans could have an additional food source. Now, would their population numbers be affected? Possibly. Okay. If they only have 1 food source, they might decrease in number over time. Second question, what could happen to the organisms on this web if the zooplankton population were to decrease? Well, then everything up above that would also decrease. Okay. Okay, I'm going to run through competition. And hopefully we'll get to end with the shark slide. And then we'll remove everything else because the shark slide's really cool. All right. So competition. We're competing for a limited resource. All resources are limited on the planet, especially when you're thinking about the parameters within their habitat. And if they have very narrow parameters for all those components of their habitat, then their resources can be even further limited. So anytime things are competed for a limited resource, you're going to have competition. That competition can be intra-specific competition, meaning between members of the same species. This most often occurs when we're talking about mates we're talking about food, we're talking about territory. That is where intra-specific competition is going to come in. It's a strong force on a population. It is something that helps keep a population in check. If a population overgrows its food source, well, then you're going to see that, curve that goes up, 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 and then crashes when they have no more food left. So, it says it limits population density to the ecosystem's carrying capacity, right? And it helps foster coexistence so that species is not getting out of balance. What we tend to maybe think more about, or maybe sometimes don't think more about because we tend to think about us, is interspecific competition. So competition between members of different species. So that could be over territory. I'm thinking like coyotes and foxes. That could be an overlap of territory and they eat the same resources. Competition for food, water, things like that. If you've ever seen those like watering hole videos, there are species that can fight over watering holes. When two or more species overlap, the more strongly they're going to start competing with each other. So if they have the same niche, you're going to see stronger competition. Now, that competition can be kind of settled out in a couple of different ways. It can be direct. It can be two species physically fighting, harming each other, vocalizations, etc., etc. Or it can be indirect. Okay? A terrible outcome is this competitive exclusion principle. It says, if two species occupy the same niche, which in this case, these two different species of paramecium do, if you put them together in the same environment, one is going to completely outcompete the other and the other is going to crash and burn. So in this particular graph, species A grows slower, but in the end ends up surviving. Species B grows faster, but ends up crashing out, right? That is the competitive exclusion principle. So two species that have the exact same limiting resources, they inhabit the same niche, one is eventually going to outcompete the other. So how did organisms over time adapt to not dying out? Well, they have niche partitioning. So this is a great example of warbler species. These warbler species occur out west, up north. These birds live in the same exact forest. They're all little tiny warblers, but they even live in the same trees, but they inhabit different levels of the trees. So when we're talking about the arrangement of habitat, this comes into play here. So this particular yellow wump warbler only inhabits about 10 feet to just under 40 feet of the habitat. This bay-breasted warbler goes from about 20 feet to 50 feet. So there's overlap, but there's not direct overlap for the majority of these species, right? This black-throated warbler has the most pressure because it lives in the intersection of 4 different warblers, but that's actually not that big of a deal because the warblers that are next to it, the black boomian and the bay-breasted, also inhabit chunks of the forest that are both higher and lower. And then the Cape May warbler occupies the highest section and also the smallest, highest section of the forest. So that's something called niche partitioning. So they coexist so that they are expanding their resource. And then we're going to stop here on this really cool shark map. Okay, so this is temporal niche partitioning. This is where competing species coexist by utilizing resources at being active at different times of day. So in this case, these sharks, okay, so this is a clock, 0, noon, all the way back to midnight, okay? So 0 is midnight, 12 is noon. All right, then we have these maps. So this shark which is the sandbar shark right here, is most active at 1600 hours. Okay. These lines are showing how much it's moving. It is moving the most at 1600 hours. So that's 4 p.m. It's moving the most at 4 p.m. So dusk. Okay. It stops moving shortly after it gets dark. The black tip shark inhabits slightly after dark at about 8 p.m. Okay. The hammerhead species, they're competing. They're having direct competition. Because look at these circles. They are both most active right around between like 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. And their activity levels overlap the most during that time. The tiger shark is just like chilling down here all by itself. It's like, y'all, you go do your competition thing. I'm going to eat at noon, just like the humans. Okay. And then you have our ball shark, which is inhabiting this really large range, but really likes to eat right around daybreak. Yep. So temporal niche partitioning is where they like don't see each other, but they're feeding in the same area, but at different times. Okay. All right, that is where we're gonna stop. It's 5:03. I'm gonna stop sharing. We'll pick up at our next training on symbiosis. How fun.
Thank you so much, Courtney. If anybody does have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat now, and we can either answer them now or get back to them during a part two or via email. As folks are heading out, I do just want to remind people that we are entering Envirothon season. So if you haven't already registered for your area competition, definitely make sure to do that. If you don't know how to do that, reach out to me and I will help you. We also have an Envirothon newsletter, and I am putting the link in chat now. It's a very long link, so apologies for that. But if you aren't subscribed to that newsletter, definitely check it out and subscribe to future newsletters, because that's where a lot of information like this training is shared, to make sure that you guys are getting all the best resources that you can. So definitely check out that newsletter, sign up for your area meet or your area competitions. And as always, if there's ever any questions about Envirothon, reach out to your local soil and water conservation district or myself. But yeah, thank you all for joining us. This has been super informative and I hope that it was beneficial. So thank you so much to everyone who joined, and a big thank you to Courtney.
Absolutely. Happy to come back, finish out. I feel like I could do like 4 of these on all the Virginia stuff. There's just
It's a
so much.
huge station for sure. I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording.